Welcome to the Power Platform Show. Thanks for joining me today. I hope today's guest inspires and educates you on the possibilities of the Microsoft Power Platform. Now, let's get on with the show. Today's guest is from Edinburgh, the United Kingdom. He works at A&S Group as a Power Platform solution architect. He's a Microsoft MVP for business applications, a published LinkedIn learning instructor, Power Platform community super user, public speaker, and host of the On Air in the Cloud podcast. He's a blogger and a mentor. So here's a full dance card, as you can see. He's trained and experienced in project management, leading teams, coaching and mentoring, and above all, he is a .NET developer. You can find links to his bio, social media, etc. in the show notes for this episode. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. Good to have you on the show. And this is an awesome topic we're discussing today, which is why should developers, .NET, C#, let's call them a traditional developer, somebody that cuts code for a living, works inside tools like VS Code and Visual Studio for their job. Why would they consider the Power Platform as a tool to build solutions on? Why did you, and we'll unpack why did you take that journey of moving from very much ProCode to using a platform that allows you to build a lot of the solution using low code, the constraints, the blessings, the things that one needs to be aware of if you're going to make that, take that journey. But before we start, food, family, and fun, what do they mean to you?
Oof. Yeah, love all of them. Love my food. It's tough to narrow down what food I enjoy the most. But yeah, I love mixing all those as well. You know, going out with family, enjoying the food. Japanese food is a highlight for me. There's so many. It's really where to begin. So yeah, love spending time with family. I live here in just near Edinburgh in Scotland, as you mentioned, with my wife Lorraine, who's from here. I'm not originally. We had a conversation before about Nottingham, where you started certain things, which is my hometown. Yes. That's where I'm from.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, many moons ago, as we were talking about there before the show, about being in bands, being in audio design and music and so on. So yeah, from there originally. I live up here in Scotland, and that is a blessing because it's such a beautiful place to live, gorgeous countryside, so much to see and do. So yeah, that's where I am. In terms of fun, there's so many things I enjoy. Again, enjoying the outdoors that we've got here, which is amazing. I often enjoy trying to be creative and making time to be creative, importantly as well. Sometimes that blurs into the community work where I can crowbar it in. Yeah. But sometimes it could be painting or drawing and kind of hands-on tactile creative side of things. In fact, during the pandemic, I was lucky enough to illustrate a business book as well. That's on Amazon.
Wow.
So that was taking the hobby to another level. It was great fun. Loved it.
That's so cool. It's interesting. Yeah, I started the podcast in Nottingham. Well, I think it was 2017. Also, no, in 2 months' time, it's the 7th year anniversary of this podcast. So it's been going a while. But in Nottingham, they claim the oldest pub in England, right? The one that's kind of under the castle there.
Yeah, that's it. Your old trip to Jerusalem, rumoured to be the oldest, which, just as you say, is built into the sandstone, the rock that the castle sits on top of. And it's I'm sure you know this story, Mark. When you're in there, we didn't pre-plan this. We're just talking about this. So it's quite funny. But one story came to mind is that when you go in, you've got all the big wooden beams that hold up all the rock above it. Mm-hmm. And you can tell the locals to the people who are tourists. Have you heard this before?
No.
So the people who go in there, when you go in and you see people at the bar and they've got a pint and they've got the beer mat sitting on top of the glass.
Yes.
Because so much of the sandstone can drip into the drink.
Yeah.
But people who've been there before are aware of that. So yeah, when you walk in and you see all these beer mats on top of pint glasses, that's why.
That's it. I hadn't observed that because I did go. I definitely went back then. But the other, Edinburgh, I mean, what a beautiful city. The first thing that took me there was the Fringe Festival. That was the first reason Meg and I went there. And boy, doesn't that city come to life when that festival's on.
It really does. And it's on this month as well. It's on right now.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's pretty much all of August. As you say, you've got all the festivals, you've got the Fringe. There's things like book festivals, film festivals, which is one of my favourites. It's another part of the fun for me as well.
Yeah.
I do love, films and movies as well. And there's just so much to see and do. It's incredible. You get the military tattoo up at the castle as well, and all the performers from all over the world. So yeah, it's just incredible. It's such a great place to live.
Yeah, we went back again because it was so good. In fact, we've been there, I think, 3 times. But we went back twice. So we went for a second Fringe Festival, and then we went back another time. I mean, it's just so easy to grab an Airbnb. So you even get to live very authentically in one of the old buildings and stuff, which is what we did. So it was a great time. Definitely love that city. So let's talk about what we're talking about today, which is, tell us a bit about your developer roots that you've done across your career.
Yeah, absolutely. So a short bit of background for me was when I went to university, I actually studied physics. But as part of that, one of the modules was programming. It was using C++. And talk about going at the deep end with a language. There's a lot of memory management and lots of deep concepts with that. It was quite far removed from certain scripting languages, whether that be Python or PowerFX. So really, I kind of started that way, took my interest, and really from the get-go, I was working for consultancies. My first was one based in London. And while I was working there, it was a great place to join because they were looking for people with any kind of technical degree, and they would provide training. So actually the projects we were on, either the technology had already been picked, or we were pairing with a bigger organization, a KPMG or a Capgemini or whatever the case was at the time, that had already architected and decided the frameworks or the technologies, and we would get training to skill up and use those. So it was a great learning curve for me. One, to be in professional development. I had to learn to play catch up with all these IT computer science graduates who joined, and I was on the back foot, so I had to play catch up. But there was also that project. My first was actually Java with Oracle. The next was VB6 with SQL Server, and so on and so on. The tech stacks changed per project, and we will get some training, either a brief amount of training or time to upskill and then join the project. So really, that helped me learn fast and adapt. But over the years, it was really using the Microsoft technologies that became the common thread. It became the common theme when I changed jobs, and I kind of veered towards that one because they had high market usage. It moved from that VB6 world into .NET, even from version 1. I remember actually having the preview version on a book of CDs, for that version 1, the beta version. And it was all about web services. I remember it's ASP.NET, web services, and what we'd see as APIs typically today. So it was learning that from the start and keeping .NET throughout the career for almost all of it. There was another organization I did join that had their own low-code system. This was about 10 years ago. But for the most part, it was .NET and surrounding technologies. So some web frameworks, lots of WinForms, and lots of things like SQL Server. So really, that's kind of been the journey up until maybe the last, 3 years or so. I joined another consultancy, and that's when, from day one, they said, okay, could you look at this thing called Power Apps? We've got a customer. They're using some legacy, I think it was Access or InfoPath apps, but they need to modernize to something that is still a low-code, no-code option. They don't need full .NET apps built from the ground up. Could you upskill in this and use it? And that was really how I got started into the low-code side of things.
Wow. Okay, so only 3 years ago, so very recent. How was that, when you asked, and it's interesting because you've had a history of updating or transferring developer skills to new languages over time. For you, when this came up, what was that initial feeling around using the tech? And I'll preface this by, I remember going into a project, it was actually a rescue project, it would have been 16, 17 years ago, where they had implemented Dynamic CRM, and back in those days it was pre-cloud, so all on-premise. And their .NET team had looked at it and said, how hard can this be? It's built on .NET. We can, tackle it, no problem. Why it was a rescue project is because they ignored the software development kit and the SDK that was in place, and they did things like SQL injections and all sorts of things that back in the day, those were all absolute no-nos in the way the platform was architected. And because they perceived it as a .NET solution, they thought they could just apply and hack it to whatever they wanted, of course, having massive implications. When you took on this technology, was that your similar thought that, well, it's .NET, I can do whatever I want with it? How was your perception of it, and what was that learning process for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's good to hear that story as well, because when I first looked into the Power Apps, I didn't even know it was development in the browser. I knew it was cloud-based, but I was like, hey, what do I install? I'm so used to, Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio or even SQL Server Management Studio, traditional client installs that I would put on the device and get ready to use. So when it came around to that, I realized, okay, this is a brand new mindset. I need to look to see, okay, what tools do I need to use? What can the tools do? How does it work? But yeah, initially my gut reaction, my instinct was, okay, well, hopefully I can just lift the bonnet, lift the hood and start tinkering around with the engine. I've done that with game development. I've done that with line of business apps. Okay, let's, dig under the hood. Let's write some custom JavaScript here. Let's write this there. So my first thought was that. And then when I realized it had its own language, I'm talking about maybe Canvas Power Apps primarily here. So that was my natural transition, say, from .NET Web Apps from the ground up over to something that was a pixel perfect, blank canvas. I can move those controls wherever I want. Mm-hmm. I can write the code behind them. And to be honest, when I first saw Power FX and the Excel formula type nature of it, I did get concerned that this might be too limiting. I've used C# to a fairly high level, I would say, fairly advanced, whether you're using certain design patterns, interfaces, memory management, whatever the case may be. I don't know it all, no one does, but I've used it to such a level that I'm so used to, almost like you say, here's some clay, I can mold it almost any way I want. And if I can't, I need to fill the gap in my knowledge and learn how I can do that. So when I did see the PowerFX and the relatively short list of functions and commands possible to use with it, at first I did think, wow, this might be a bit limiting. But when I took a step back, learned more, I did realize, okay, there are different ways of tackling it. When I then took it further to say, okay, I've really hit what I feel is a limit here, that's when I started to read up on how to use development tools and extend the platform. And by extend, not just .NET, I might push a few things into Azure Functions or something, and offload it there and do the work there. Then I can use my C# or another language with functions, or other approaches are available as well. But it was really, again, the more I learned, the more I realized, I'm not so constrained. It maybe can't do everything I need, but I've not hit anything yet, line of business, that's held me back. And so the more I learned, the more I kept digging and digging. And then I enjoyed that new learning curve as well. And it's a bit like this with those creative things we talked about in the fun, which is when you've got constraints, it's like, I've got to use problem solving now. How can I make it do this with a limited tool set? So that made it more fun for me as well.
So now with your knowledge of things, how does the Power Platform integrate with .NET and the ecosystems that surround .NET?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the primary ones I think of with .NET, and really with the Power Platform, I think there are so many other languages you can use to extend it, .NET based and others. Primarily for .NET, one of the prime candidates I go for is really Dataverse plugins. So, these maybe play more of a part, taking a step back with Power Apps, let's say model-driven apps. These are mostly UIs auto-generated based off the data model, but sometimes you can't tap into every feature that you need, that you may want to with the code behind. So in some of those cases, writing a plugin using C# can be a great option. And that's typically at the moment, a way of like an event-driven action that happens on the Dataverse. A new account is created, fire off this piece of C# code that does this work, almost like a trigger on a SQL Server database. It's there and it's auto-generated, it's event-driven. So that's one of the primary ways that works really well. There are a few other ways. I think another way as well, again, I mentioned Azure Functions before. That's a way you can offload processing to an Azure function. If you want something that's going to be scalable, or you want the C# or that language to do something a bit more complex with the logic, call other APIs, call other functions, might have an orchestrator in there. Then there are, ways of calling that as well. Really, really powerful. And the great thing with functions as well, even though we're talking about .NET, you can write it using Python or JavaScript or Java or another language as well. So it's kind of fairly agnostic to an extent as well. So they're the two kind of fields I really think about. And then we do have other languages like JavaScript and others, not part of .NET, but you can use those to extend the Power Platform as well.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you ready to transform your career in just 90 days? Join me on the 90-Day Mentoring Challenge and unlock your full potential. As I listen to the podcast, enroll now and get 10% off using the code MBAP. That's MBAP at the checkout. Don't miss this opportunity to learn from industry leaders and accelerate your growth. Visit ako.nz365guy.com and start your journey today. Nice. So in your opinion, why would a traditional developer add the Power Platform to their toolset?
One of the main benefits that I've seen as a sometime business owner and a manager as well is really the speed of development. It's really something that I think when I got over my initial learning curve of what is this, what can it do, I realized that, the drag and drop, the low code, sometimes no code nature of this means I can spin up something very, very quickly. And again, if I'm running a business or a business unit and I'm looking, if I have people proficient in .NET, low code and many other areas, if I was going to write it from the ground up using code, let's say C#, SQL Server for the back end, maybe a React framework or something on the front end for the web app, I'd be looking at more sprints. I really would. It would take more time, take more work. There's pros and cons to both, paths for sure. But I think for many line of business applications, if you want grids, you want forms, you want buttons that perform actions, you want automation and things that send emails or drive efficiencies within an organization, then really 80, 90, if not 100% can be achieved with the Power Platform in my experience.
So what about limitations? Are there limitations with the Power Platform that developers specifically should be aware of in their use case scenarios? Or are there really no limitations because you have the full ability to extend wherever you need to using traditional means?
That's a great question. And the reason I say that is because I think with any stack, there are limitations. And there certainly are with the Power Platform. I mean, being able to extend and use developer tools is fantastic, but there are also limits. So I think in terms of the limits, some of the issues I've come across are, this was an early learning experience for me, which was that I was writing a Power App using Dataverse as the data platform behind it. But one issue I did find with that is Dataverse, if using relational tables, that side of it, the Power Platform's using Azure services behind the scenes. It's an abstraction on top of it. You can get into those services if you need. So Dataverse was great. You can create tables using click and drag, create table, add column. Fantastic. But because it was Azure SQL database, I did find that I did miss some of the fine tuning I could do with the SQL Server. If I want to place an index on a specific column, create the foreign keys where I need them, create user-defined functions, taking it to that level is something that, again, with the Dataverse, I'm not able to get to that level. But then the other option, the workaround may be, well, instead of using Dataverse as the data platform, considering moving to Azure SQL, using that connector does require premium, but you can then reach into that. So again, there is a workaround, but there may be limit. Oh, now you need licensing. Well, you would for Dataverse anyway. But
if you already had Dataverse, you'd be licensed for it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, good point. So I think there can be the more learning you go through and realize where these limits are. Dataverse, it has a 2-minute timeout on operations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for most, transactional usage, that's fairly acceptable. You want something sub-second or only a few seconds, you're probably going to be fine, right? But on the occasion, you're running, I don't know, something silly here, a year-long report, a quarter-end financial, something that needs a bit of grunt to it. You might offload that to Azure Functions so you can bypass that 2-minute timeout limit and do the work, then bring it back. But then there may be cost implications because it's serverless, it's pay-per-use. So there are workarounds, but being aware of them and knowing, well, what is the cost of that or the potential forecast cost of that is important. And some of the other cost or tax might be when you extend the Power Platform, you might need to know about these Azure services like functions, how do webhooks work. You might need JavaScript to do some client-side scripting on a model-driven app. Again, for the times when it doesn't quite do everything out of the box that you need. Okay, that's another language I need to learn. Okay, what else? Oh, there's something called Fetch XML. Okay, what else? The list can go on the more you want to extend it. So then some people I know have given me feedback on training I've given before, which is saying, I'm learning so many languages, I'm almost becoming a pro dev here. And they've got a good point.
You mentioned Fetch XML there. How do you explain that is that something 100% unique to the Power Platform? Is it something that a developer coming into it, what do they need to know?
Great question. Yeah, another good one because it's something I've only used with a Power Platform. Fetch XML, the way I see it, there's probably a better explanation, is a way of performing a query. And because I come from the SQL Server world using Transact SQL, I almost always exactly translate that SQL query on. There are tools in the XRM toolbox and others that do this as well, that translate that query. What entity or table you're going to, how many records you're bringing back, are you joining to other tables or entities, are you sorting or ordering, doing an order by, again, speaking in Transact SQL language, of that result that gets returned. So yeah, you can see it in model-driven apps within Power Apps. It's also really useful for Power Automate Cloud Flows. So another limitation, this will bring us back to with Power Automate Flows, there might be API limits, there might be usage limits, or you pay per execution, depending on the licensing, of which there are many that you may go through. If you go to a table with 1,000 records, but you only need to run some actions on only the 10 active records, Fetch XML is a great way of providing that query so you can really target just those records. And now you're only looping around 10. You're not doing API calls for all 1,000 records of the table. So yeah, I don't know. That's in a nutshell.
No. So this is interesting because, I've interviewed a few people now in your similar position, and you're the first one that's really giving me a really good breakdown of the limitations. Because I know the limitations are there, but often people have worked with the platform so long that they have kind of glossed over those. And my question is, why Fetch XML at all? Why couldn't you do it using, as we say, the traditional ways of doing the querying? Why do we need Fetch XML in the mix?
You're right. It's almost another addition. And certainly with Power Automate Cloud Flows, and thanks for the compliment as well, by the way, I'll take it. I know we had some excellent technical people on from, Raphael to Scott Giro and many others. But, it's an interesting one because you can use OData syntax as well. There are many ways of providing filtering. Again, it does feel like, is this another bolt-on, another thing to learn? It certainly does feel that way for me at the moment. And I do get that feedback from others that I've coached as well, saying, well, I know SQL Server. Can I not just? We can't just.
Yeah.
It's, unfortunately, another translation there is, going to a Dataverse table and creating a view. Hey, it's great. You can filter it and do it a sort, but it's quite limited. Where when you go and write a SQL query, you can take it as far as you want, typically. Yeah.
I'd be interested in if any of the guests want to feedback on it. But I have a feeling from back in the day when Fetch first came out, and that I remember, the reason it came about was a security reason. And whether it had to do with, we had this thing called sandbox environments back at the very early days of going to cloud, so much more. And when I say sandbox, it was sandboxing your code in production. We're not talking about a dev test type environment, but specifically around protecting rogue code from damaging other people in the same cluster within Azure. Now, that's, reaching back into my memory, and I don't know if I'm absolutely accurate in that. It'll be interesting to get feedback. But that's why I think Fetch XML actually exists or in the mix. I mean, the person, of course, to ask would be our Swedish friend who's the number one XRM toolbox developer, Jonas. He would know why, because I think his number one tool is on Fetch XML, isn't it, within that tool set?
I believe it is Jonas Rapp.
Yeah.
That's a good person to ask because, as you say, it almost translates exactly like a Transact SQL query for me. But the way you've explained the secure processing, almost like some chips can do these days with enclaves and different ways of working, does feel like a way of, as you say, keeping that in a safe silo, a sandbox. It reach further out.
Yeah.
Almost back like the web service days. You keep it encapsulated behind the wall. You send your request, you get your response. Interesting. Okay, yeah. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, I'm not 100%, but that's what pokes out from the shadows back there. How much of your work nowadays involves still using traditional code in the applications that you build? Now, the first example you gave, which was an InfoPath upgrade, is what I really saw squarely Canvas apps was designed to do, right? An InfoPath replacement. InfoPath by nature wasn't a mobile solution. It was built in a time where nobody had mobile devices. And so it was end-of-lifed on the SharePoint environment for that reason. We saw particularly the Canvas app model come out into play. But you've come a long way since then, and I assume that you've been on some very large projects. And I have a thing that I say, I have never seen an enterprise implementation of the Power Platform that didn't involve ProCode. It always does, in my experience. It always needs some form of ProCode development. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And to the extent, whether it is 80-20 in favor of low code, or whether the lines could be blurred. Now, for some of those, examples, it may be, again, back to my early days, the tech stack has already been chosen. It's already in SQL Server or Azure SQL database. It's already hosted up in the cloud already. We're using that. That compared to, say, Dataverse and the storage limits and the costing of Dataverse to extend those storage limits could be a great reason to keep it SQL Server either in Azure or maybe even on-prem still. I know there are several customers still using it on-prem and it still works great. You can use an on-prem data gateway, communicate with it, and it works absolutely fine. I think you mentioned there as well, the other pro-code options could be, 90% of these user-facing apps can be done with model-driven. Again, that might save a sprint or more when compared to Canvas. So a bit of background there as well. Many of us might know that with Canvas being pixel perfect, that's fantastic. But you've got to build your own responsiveness if you really want that.
Yeah.
Luckily, recently, offline features came in, which made offline capabilities much easier than the code-based way we had to do as of a year ago previously. You'd almost have to code your own within PowerFX, cache what you want, sync it the way you need it. Now you can actually turn it on, create a profile that manages this. How often does it keep in sync? It manages so much more. But anyway, I'm digressing.
Interesting.
So you might choose, a model-driven app. It's responsive. It's accessible out of the box. You've saved a bunch of time. All your apps are going to have a consistent look and feel, unless you tinker with the UI too much or create a load of custom pages. But again, some of those limits with a model-driven app, they bring all those benefits, but the amount of times I've had to open up to use JavaScript to do client-side scripting, or again, create some plugins because when it gets saved at the big powerful server on the back end, trigger something automatically or do some other complex logic is very, very common. Now with the Canvas, you can probably write much of that in the PowerFX yourself. You have almost full control of the code and what the buttons do, the code behind on those. But with model-driven, it comes with lots of benefits, but sometimes requires those extensibilities as well.
Some trade-offs. Do you know that we had offline access over 10 years ago. In what we built and I'm talking, so it used SQLite back in those days on device. And so we're talking about serious offline, right? Serious.
Yeah.
I think SQLite did 2 gigs was its limit. So
Access was as well. That was 2 gigs for a time. Yeah.
That was a serious amount of offline, right? This is much more than cached offline. This was, so yeah, back in the day is that there used to be a COM object that plugged into Outlook, and you use SQLite, and that allowed you to go online, offline, and run the full, back then, Dynamics experience in offline mode. And then it had a bunch of rules that when you came back online, if 2 people had updated a record right down to a field level, like last on, last off type thing, like how that would work. But it's interesting that it's taken this long for a real robust offline solution to come about again, since that, COM object wasn't the way to do it anymore. But we had a very large implementation that involved road workers going to remote locations that had no mobile coverage, nothing, and they had to collect data around roading infrastructure like bridge decay, road surface decay, that type of thing. And we built the entire thing on Dynamics. And they had these Toughen type devices inside their roadwork trucks with touch screens, even back then. And so they would be able to mark a defect on the road and be able to draw a circle and say, let's say the defect was 3 meters wide, and select from what type of defect, which would then create ultimately a bill of works materials to come and fix that. But until they went back to the office and got Wi-Fi connection and resync that device, that wouldn't then update into the central system and create the work order and, fire off all the rules. And so, yeah, this was well over 10 years ago. That type of functionality was there in the platform.
That's impressive as well. It's funny because I used to work in construction organization, and this was before low code. And I remember actually building that from the ground up using code with .NET apps with SQLite on ruggedized Android tablets, cheaper end because, accidents happened.
Yeah.
And it performed the same thing. In fact, when we rolled it out, we didn't have Wi-Fi hotspots within our own workshop, which was spread across many fields.
Yeah.
So we did the same thing that when you get back to the hub, the sync happens at that point.
Yep.
And it was quite interesting to build it from the ground up, but to think about the syncing, what design patterns are you using?
Exactly.
The merge conflicts you just mentioned.
Yes.
Is it the last one wins, or do you flag it as a merge conflict that you have to resolve? There's a lot of problems to be solved. Lots of technical challenges.
Yeah. Back there, I think these were HP ruggedized devices. So they're expensive, and we've got photos there. These guys were, the high-vis, never used a computer in their life. Everything had been done on paper. And so even the adoption training for them to all of a sudden go to this type of experience, full ArcGIS integration back then as well, because that was the detailed mapping technology you had to have, but just phenomenal. Once again, it was cheaper to build that on the Power Platform predecessor, which was, if we translated to what we have today as Dynamics 365 Sales, is what we used. We just ripped off. We didn't need account. We didn't need contact. We got rid of all that. And we built all our own tables. Back then we called them entities. And on top of that, and used it, and was still cheaper than buying an Oracle system for that government agency, to buy an off-the-shelf roading management system or infrastructure system, because it's more than just roads. It was like roads, bridges, culverts, power, any power, lighting, on the network, traffic lights, all that kind of stuff was all owned by the roading agency. So, yeah, asset management really at scale and the full maintenance of it.
Interesting project.
Yeah. Keith, it's been great talking to you. You've definitely dropped some very telling insights about the Power Platform, which is exactly what I wanted to get out there, kind of lay it bare. For years, Microsoft has used this concept of no cliffs. And it's funny, there's no cliffs until you absolutely step over one. And then you realize that there was a cliff, and now you've got to backtrack and figure out how to solve something. And so that's why I like some of these candid conversations, to really as we would say, call a spade and say, hey, there be dragons there. It's the edge of the world or what we know, and you need to be aware of these things. And I just think it makes us all smarter, stronger, better to be able to create great things on the Power Platform. So, yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back, Mark. It's been a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Business Application MVP, Mark Smith, otherwise known as the NZ365 Guy. If there's a guest you'd like to see on the show, please message me on LinkedIn. If you want to be a supporter of the show, please check out buymeacoffee.com/NZ365 Guy. Stay safe out there and shoot for the stars.